I found a way into a boarded-up smokehouse. A widow whispered, "He comes back every time I'm alone." Rhett Donnelly had $8, a duffel bag with a set of hand tools he'd carried since his last steady job on a farm outbuilding restoration crew, and a habit of checking any boarded-up structure he passed for shelter, a habit that had led him, more than once that year, to exactly the kind of forgotten building that kept him dry for a few weeks at a stretch. He was 21 years old, laid off 7 months earlier, when the small restoration company that employed him lost its remaining contracts to a larger regional operator, eliminating his entire position in a single afternoon. He had been moving through farm country ever since, taking whatever short-term work he could find. The layoff had come with barely a week's notice, the company's own owner explaining with evident regret that a small local crew simply couldn't compete against a larger operator's contract pricing, however much personal value he'd placed on Rhett's own careful work over the years. Rhett had spent the 7 months since relearning, farm town by farm town, that his particular skill with restoring old outbuildings mattered a great deal less to most temporary employers than whether he had a fixed address and a reference from the last 6 months. He found the old smokehouse on a cool evening in early autumn, its windows boarded, but its doors showing signs of recent careful use rather than the total neglect its exterior otherwise suggested. Rhett worked one of the boards loose enough to slip through, understanding from the door's condition that he wasn't necessarily looking at an abandoned structure after all. The interior smelled faintly of old smoke and cured wood, decades of use lingering in the timber, even though the structure had clearly stopped serving its original purpose long ago. He had barely stepped inside when a hand closed over his wrist, and a voice, barely above a whisper, hissed a warning that stopped him completely. "Quiet, please. He's still out there." In the dim light filtering through the gaps in the boarded windows, Rhett made out an elderly woman crouched against the smokehouse's far wall, her whole body rigid with a listening tension that told him, before she said another word, that whatever danger she was hiding from was entirely real. They stayed frozen together for several long minutes, listening to the sound of a car idling somewhere near the farmhouse, a door opening and closing, footsteps crossing gravel with unhurried confidence. Rhett could hear a man's voice, faint and indistinct through the smokehouse's boarded walls, calling out something that might have been Luvenia's name, the particular casual persistence of someone entirely unconcerned about whether anyone answered. Eventually the engine started again, and the car pulled away down the long drive, the sound fading gradually into the evening quiet. Only once the sound had faded entirely did the woman finally release her grip on his wrist, her whole body sagging with visible relief. "I'm sorry," she whispered, still not raising her voice fully. "I didn't mean to frighten you nearly as much as he's been frightening me. Name's Luvenia Castellana. This is my late husband's farm. I've taken to hiding out here whenever I see that particular car coming up the drive." "How long have you been doing this?" Rhett asked, matching her careful quiet even though the immediate danger had apparently passed. 3 months now," Luvenia said. "I've grown considerably too familiar with this particular corner of my own smokehouse, if I'm honest. I never imagined at my age that I'd be reduced to hiding on my own property from a man who was once my husband's friend." "Who was that?" Rhett asked. "A man named Garrison Voss," Luvenia said. "He claims my husband owed him a considerable debt before he passed. Money Garrison insists I'm now obligated to repay, with property from this farm if I can't produce the cash. He comes back every time I'm alone, always when my neighbor's away or my son's visiting his own family out of state. I don't think that timing is accidental." She drew the blanket she'd wrapped around herself a bit tighter, the particular gesture of someone still not fully convinced the danger had passed for the night. Over the following hour, sitting together in the smokehouse's dim quiet, Luvenia told Rhett the fuller story of exactly what had brought a genuine physical fear into her own home these past several months. Her husband Thaddeus had, according to Garrison's own account, borrowed a substantial sum from him 2 years before his death, an informal private loan meant to help cover a difficult season's expenses, never properly documented beyond what Garrison himself described as a verbal agreement between two longtime friends. Thaddeus's death 8 months earlier had left Luvenia facing Garrison's increasingly insistent demands for repayment, demands that had escalated in recent weeks into these unannounced visits, timed specifically for moments when she had no one else nearby to witness his behavior. The first visit, right after the funeral, seemed almost reasonable, Luvenia said. He expressed his condolences, mentioned the loan almost in passing, said we could discuss repayment whenever I was ready. I didn't think much of it at the time, grief being what it was. It wasn't until the third or fourth visit that I noticed the pattern, always timed for exactly when I was most alone, always slightly more insistent than the visit before it. I don't have any record of this loan, Luvenia said. Thaddeus never mentioned it to me, not once in 30 years of marriage, where he told me nearly everything else about our finances. I don't know whether to believe Garrison entirely, or whether he's simply seen an opportunity in my husband's death that he wouldn't have dared attempt while Thaddeus was still alive to dispute it directly. Has he ever produced any documentation of this loan? Rhett asked. Nothing beyond his own word, Luvenia said. He says the agreement was informal, between friends, and that Thaddeus's death simply means I've inherited the obligation along with everything else. I don't have the money to pay him, and I don't have anyone with the standing to properly challenge his claim beyond simply refusing and hoping he eventually gives up. Rhett spent the following days doing the only thing he knew how to do with what little he had. He helped Luvenia search through Thaddeus's old financial records, understanding that a man who told his wife nearly everything about their finances would likely have left some trace of a debt this significant, if it had actually existed the way Garrison claimed. They searched the workshop methodically over several afternoons, Luvenia growing increasingly discouraged with each drawer and shelf that failed to produce anything relevant, until Rhett noticed a small strongbox tucked behind a shelf of tools, positioned in a way that suggested Thaddeus had deliberately kept it somewhat out of casual view. It was in that small strongbox in Thaddeus's old workshop that Rhett found a folder of financial records considerably more complete than anything Luvenia had previously located, including a canceled check and a handwritten receipt confirming that Thaddeus had, in fact, borrowed money from Garrison 3 years earlier, but had repaid the full amount, with interest, nearly a year before his own death. This settles it entirely, Rhett said, reading through the documents carefully, checking the dates twice to be certain he understood the timeline correctly. Garrison's claiming a debt that was actually paid off in full over a year before Thaddeus died. Whatever he's demanding now isn't a legitimate debt at all. It's simply a fabricated claim against a widow he's decided won't have the resources to properly dispute it. Luvenia read the receipt herself, her hands trembling with an emotion considerably more complicated than simple relief. Thaddeus signed this receipt himself, she said. I recognize his handwriting immediately. I don't understand why Garrison would think this claim could hold up, knowing this document existed somewhere in this house the whole time. I don't think he expected you to actually find it, Rhett said. I think he's been counting on your grief and isolation to keep you too overwhelmed to search properly. The same way he's been timing his visits to keep you too frightened to think clearly about defending yourself. He set the documents down carefully on the workshop's cluttered table, understanding the weight of what they'd just found deserved a moment of quiet before either of them moved to act on it. They contacted a rural attorney the following morning, a careful man named Foster Cray, whose name Rhett recognized from stories he'd heard traveling through other farm counties. And Cray reviewed the canceled check and receipt with evident satisfaction once he understood the full situation. Cray's office, a modest practice specializing in exactly this kind of rural financial dispute, examined both documents carefully against the specific dates Louvenia provided for Garrison's escalating visits, cross-referencing the timeline with evident thoroughness. "This is about as clean a defense as I've seen in a case like this," Cray told them. "A canceled check and a signed receipt, both dated well before your husband's death, directly contradict any claim that this debt remained outstanding. I'd recommend we send Mr. Voss formal notice immediately, along with a clear warning that continued harassment could constitute grounds for a restraining order, given the pattern you've described of these repeated, deliberately timed visits. How quickly could a restraining order actually be granted if he doesn't stop after the notice?" Louvenia asked. "Considerably faster than most people expect, given a documented pattern this clear," Cray said. "Courts take deliberately timed harassment seriously, particularly when it's aimed at an elderly widow with no other party present to witness it. I don't think Mr. Voss will want that particular pattern examined closely in front of a judge, once he understands the consequences of continuing." Garrison Voss arrived at the farm 3 days later, having received Cray's formal notice, considerably less confident than the pattern of his previous visits had apparently established. He arrived in daylight this time, a detail Rhett noted immediately as significant given Louvenia's earlier description of his carefully timed evening visits. "Mrs. Castellane," Garrison said. Standing at the farmhouse door with a folder of his own papers, he seemed suddenly less eager to produce than his earlier visits had suggested. "I understand there's been some confusion about the loan Thaddeus and I arranged." "There's no confusion at all," Louvenia said, with a steadiness Rhett hadn't heard in her voice during any of their previous conversations about Garrison's visits. "I have a canceled check and a signed receipt confirming that debt was paid in full, with interest, nearly a year before Thaddeus passed. I think you already knew that, Garrison, which is rather why you've been counting on me never finding the proof." Garrison's composure faltered visibly, replaced by something considerably more defensive. "Thaddeus and I had a complicated financial history," he said. "That receipt might have covered one particular transaction. I don't believe it necessarily settles everything between us." "I'd think a court would find one signed receipt considerably more compelling than your own unsupported recollection of a supposedly more complicated history," Rhett said, stepping forward from the doorway where he'd been standing. "I'd suggest you consider carefully whether pursuing this further is actually worth the legal exposure you're now facing, given the harassment pattern documented alongside this fraudulent claim." "Harassment?" Garrison repeated, something almost incredulous in his tone. "I've simply been trying to collect what I'm owed." "You've been timing your visits specifically for when I'm alone, for months," Louvenia said. "I don't think that pattern reads as simple debt collection to anyone reviewing it objectively, Garrison. I think it reads exactly like what it actually is." Garrison left without further argument, and Cray's formal complaint, filed the following week, prompted the county to issue a formal warning against any further contact, a warning Garrison apparently took seriously enough that his visits stopped entirely from that point forward. Cray called Louvenia personally once the county's warning had been formally delivered, confirming that Garrison's own attorney had advised him against any further pursuit of the fraudulent claim given the strength of the documentation now on record. "I don't expect you'll hear from him again," Cray told her. "Men like Garrison tend to rely on a target's isolation and uncertainty. Once that isolation breaks and the uncertainty resolves in the target's favor, the whole strategy generally collapses rather quickly. I don't know how to describe what it feels like, after months of dreading every car that turns up that drive, to simply not have to brace myself anymore," Louvenia told Rhett, once the matter was fully resolved. "I'd nearly convinced myself I would have to keep hiding in that smokehouse indefinitely, that there was no version of this where the visits actually stopped, rather than merely paused. "You don't have to hide any further," Rhett said. "Thaddeus's own careful records protected you. It simply took somebody willing to search the workshop properly to find them." Rhett stayed on at the farm through that winter and the ones that followed. The smokehouse that had first given him an evening's shelter, and Luvenia an evening's terror, becoming gradually something closer to a shared home than either of them had expected when a stranger first slipped through a loose board into the middle of somebody else's fear. He spent that first year restoring the smokehouse itself alongside the farm's other neglected structures, understanding it had earned a particular significance in both their memories, and helped Luvenia manage the property's ordinary needs that had gone unattended during the months she'd spent consumed by fear rather than the farm's actual daily requirements. He replaced the boarded windows with proper glass, repaired the door's failing hinges, and restored the small structure to something considerably more welcoming than the frightened hiding place it had first served as. Luvenia, in turn, began venturing into town more regularly once the threat of Garrison's visits had genuinely passed, reconnecting with neighbors and friends she distanced herself from during the worst of her isolation. "I stopped seeing people those months," Luvenia admitted one evening that winter. "I told myself I simply needed quiet to grieve properly. But I think, looking back, I was also ashamed somehow of what Garrison was putting me through, as though his behavior reflected some failing of my own rather than simply his." She stared into the kitchen's warm lamplight a moment longer before continuing. "I think that shame is exactly what he was counting on, whether or not he'd have ever admitted it plainly. A frightened, isolated woman doesn't reach out for help nearly as readily as one who trusts her own judgment. I don't think isolation is ever really a choice in circumstances like that," Rhett said. "I think it's more often what fear does to a person, whether or not they'd ever choose it deliberately. Thaddeus would have been glad to know his own careful habits finally protected me properly." Luvenia told Rhett one evening, the two of them sitting together in the farmhouse kitchen, warm and well lit in a way that felt, finally, entirely safe. "He always kept meticulous records of everything, even when I sometimes teased him for being overly cautious about it. I don't think either of us ever imagined those records would someday be the very thing that saved me from a fraud neither of us could have anticipated. I think he'd have been glad about more than just the records," Rhett said. "I think he'd have been glad you finally had somebody standing beside you through those months, rather than facing that fear entirely alone." Rhett wrote to his own mother that winter, describing the smokehouse and the whole strange sequence of events that had led a routine search for shelter to become, in the end, exactly the kind of steady purpose he'd feared he might never find again after the layoff ended his own restoration career. Her reply came a few weeks later, brief but warm in the particular way Rhett remembered growing up with. "Your grandfather always said the right kind of stranger shows up exactly when a person stopped expecting anyone to. Sounds like you found your way into exactly that kind of story, on exactly the right evening." Rhett thought, some evenings that winter, about the 7 months of towns and layoff notices that had led him to a loose board in a smokehouse wall on an ordinary autumn evening, and understood, watching Luvenia move through her own kitchen with a confidence she hadn't carried in months, that he had found, at the end of that unsettled stretch, exactly the kind of purpose his own grandfather had modeled decades before he was old enough to understand it. Not simply steady work, but the particular privilege of arriving, entirely by chance, on the one evening a frightened widow most needed somebody else to witness exactly what she'd been enduring alone. So, here's the question worth sitting with tonight. How many people endure a pattern of deliberately timed intimidation alone because the person targeting them has carefully calculated exactly when witnesses won't be present to see it happening? And what does it take? A stranger slipping through a loose board on exactly the wrong evening, a receipt found in a workshop strongbox, an attorney willing to move quickly once he understood what was actually at stake, for that patent to finally come to an end. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Ember and Rail, because there's always room by the fire for one more, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight.